No, people don't hate feminine starter Pokemon, or even feminine Pokemon for that matter. Well, for the most part. People just hate very specific Pokemon for very specific reasons. Like that time when Greninja was the most hated Pokemon in the world, all based off the way that it looked in a single screenshot. And that's supposed to be the most popular starter Pokemon in Kalos. To address the question of whether people hate feminine Pokemon, we're gonna explore some of the most hated starter Pokemon, starting with both Greninja and Chikorita, and talk about the history that each Pokemon went through to prove why masculine and feminine qualities have nothing to do with their overall hate and popularity. For Chikorita, it's hate from both the anime and the games. In the anime, it was seen as super clingy and annoying by some fans. In the games, it has always been one of the weakest starters possible. And that last one is not an opinion. That's a fact, and this is coming from someone who loves Chikorita. The overall negativity surrounding these Pokemon is resurfacing on the internet again because it's now a starter in Pokemon Legends ZA, so now everything looks greatly exaggerated on the internet. But it's true, Chikorita has largely been hated. But with the additions of the Legends ZA starters, do you know which Kalos starters have also received equal amounts of hate? Literally every single one of them except for Totodile. I know Tepig, the Chespin, and Fennekin lines were all obvious, but you probably thought I was messing around when I mentioned Greninja. But I'm not joking. To address the question of whether people hate feminine starter Pokemon or not, we have to start with the most popular new gen starter and go back in time to a unique few days in the history of the Pokemon community. A few days before X and Y was released, because during this time, Greninja was straight up the single most hated Pokemon on the planet. For those of you that don't know, during X and Y's hype cycle, Game Freak had shown us the middle stages of the Kalos starters, but they were keeping the final evolutions a secret. Unfortunately, someone had managed to get their hands on an illegal copy of the games days before and posted screenshots of the game, with Greninja being one of the key screenshots. And do you know what happened after that? Greninja was labeled as a fake. It was labeled as a fake Pokemon. No way Frogadier would have evolved into something like that. No way Game Freak would ruin Froakie's final evolution like that. No way the water starter would be that ugly. That Pokemon sucks. And just shortly after, the Nintendo ninjas got the leaker, and the screenshots were removed, confirming that this Pokemon was indeed real, and the whole community was in disarray. They were distraught. Hashtag Team Froakie was in shambles. Many of the Froakie believers jumped ship to the other two starters. They couldn't stand their adorable little frog turn into this monstrosity. The horrors were endless. The game came out, and the ones who stuck through made their choice. We picked Froakie and suddenly, you know what? Greninja ain't that bad. It's fun to use, probably the strongest of the bunch. Cool typing, cool signature moves. It moves pretty cool in 3D. It's kinda odd in comparison to Frogadier, but you know what? It's fun to play with. So much fun that people even forgot that Greninja was super hated when it first came out. And from there, you know how it goes. Its popularity just exploded. Special treatment in the anime, a playable character in Smash Bros, a unique form, merch across the board, it became the new Charizard. But it started off with massive hate. And I don't think I need to explain it, but Greninja is more so on the masculine side of things than it is on the feminine side, but that didn't excuse it from any kind of hate or negativity. People didn't like the way it looked initially, but then they gave it a chance, and it turned out to be one of the most fun starters out of the three, as well as a few other things, and now it's one of the most popular starters of all time. Chikorita, on the other hand, doesn't have the same story. While I was very much alive for Generation 2, I wasn't old enough or cognizant enough to be aware of Pokemon fans reacting to a new generation of starters. In fact, I wasn't even aware of new generations until Generation 3, so I don't exactly know if Chikorita was hated or not when it first came out. I don't know the initial reception of the Pokemon, but I have some ideas. You see, while I wasn't aware enough to be there for the reveal of the new starter Pokemon on the playground, I was around and aware enough to hear what people thought about the Pokemon overall at the peak of Generation 2. And what did 4-year-old me understand? That people hated it. Let's break this down into 3 parts: the overall design, the games, and its appearance in the anime. Between the first 6 starter Pokemon, Chikorita is the most feminine one. And fellas, I don't know about you guys, but growing up as a kid, I did have this idea about being cool. So I did only want to use cool Pokemon, and Chikorita was not cool. Sure, I did pick Squirtle as my starter in Generation 1 for being cute and approachable, but even with his Gen 1 sprite, it still has some slight cool factor to it. Or rather, it wasn't uncool. Chikorita didn't have any of that. Chikorita at the time did seem to me that it was a starter made for girls. At least that's what I thought, because the other 5 were cool in nature, whereas Chikorita wasn't. To this day though, Chikorita has the same male to female ratio as other starter Pokemon. But despite that, people commonly refer to Chikorita as a she. So it tells that this is rather unique amongst the first 6 starters. Now sure, you can say what you want about me as a kid and not liking the design or the Pokemon for being feminine, but you'd be an idiot to criticize a child for their preferences in fictional monsters. It's as good as someone saying they prefer fire-type Pokemon over normal-type Pokemon. And even then, if for some reason you want to call out younger me for anything, I still like Chikorita. I just didn't like it as much as the other 5. Even as the Pokemon evolved, Typhlosion for Alligator really grew and looked menacing and fearsome, whereas Meganium was just like a bigger Chikorita. As I grew older, I personally came to appreciate this whole line more, but it's not like I ever hated it. I just wasn't a big fan in comparison to the other starters. And as I grew older, I began to appreciate feminine Pokemon more and more. Togetic, Gardevoir, Milotic, and Mismagius, these are all very feminine Pokemon that I really love using now. But as a kid, if you had asked me, I hated these Pokemon. Was I wrong for that? Well, you already know my answer, but I will say this. A big part of the reason as to why I began to like these Pokemon is not just because I began to appreciate their design choice and aesthetic, but it's because I began to understand how powerful they really were as Pokemon. If people in general hated Chikorita, Bayleaf, and Meganium for being a feminine design, do you really think that people will want Meganium to be a fairy type? Like, let's be real here. Between the 17 other types, the one that the majority of people want to see Meganium receive is the fairy typing. And if you look at the list of fairy type Pokemon, I don't think it's an outlandish statement to say that the majority of fairy type Pokemon have feminine designs in nature. So, if it was really hated for being feminine, no one will be asking for Meganium to be a fairy type. Because they don't care about the design more than they care about the usefulness. Because Fairy is one of, if not, the strongest typing in the game, and people just want to see Meganium be useful. Which brings me to my next point, how it fares up in the games. I never saw anyone use Chikorita on the playground as a kid, and that's because Chikorita was intentionally made to be bad in the games, and so no one used it. And no one had the chance to like it through there, and if they did use it, well, yeah, they learned the hard way as to why it was made to be intentionally bad. Here's the thing, if you look at Pokemon Red and Blue, it's arguable as to which of the starters is the best to use in the game, and which is the worst. There's a general order that's there, but all 3 of the starters have their strengths and weaknesses throughout the game. The Venusaur line clears the early game, the Charizard line clears the late game, and the Blastoise line is good in general throughout the game. In Generation 2 with Johto, the same principle didn't apply. Cyndaquil is the strongest one of the 3, with being the strong against 3 of the gym leaders, weak to none of them, and none of the Elite 4, and just resisted by Claire and Lance, which all of the Johto starters here will be, so I won't make mention of Claire and Lance any further. But amongst the Elite 4, Koga uses 3 bug types, so Typhlosion does well there too. For Alligator is a solid neutral option where it's not really good against Gym Leader or Elite 4 members, but it doesn't suffer facing them either. There's no real bad type matchup either way, so it's able to do well, especially with some coverage moves and all. But Meganium straight up doesn't fare well against Falconer, Bugsy, Morty, because his team is also all poison types, Jasmine, Price, and Koga. You're at more than half the Pokemon League roster if you count Claire and Lance in this, so it's very apparent that the starter trio was made intentionally in a way where players had a secret internal easy, medium, and hard mode. Cyndaquil is the easy mode starter, Totodile is the normal mode starter, and Chikorita is the hard mode starter. But growing up, and even now, most people aren't going to think that. They're just going to look at the Pokemon and look at the region and be like, this Pokemon sucks within this region. And yeah, it's true. Chikorita does suck in Johto. Going back to Greninja, it didn't matter that Greninja was perceived to be a terrible design, because in terms of usage in battle, Greninja performed well. Not just well, people loved it because it could carry them through the games, and so the perception of the Pokemon changed. Meganium didn't have that because the Johto region intentionally made it difficult for the starter to persevere. Maybe in Legend CA, Chikorita will be given a region where it can dominate in, and if it does, and when it happens, I guarantee that you'll see people's opinion of the Chikorita line change, because in no way, shape, or form has it had that avenue yet. You see, there have been other starters like Blaziken, Empoleon, and Superior who may not have been an ideal starter choice for their region, but through updated move pools and abilities and other buffs, they became very useful in future generations in the competitive scene. But when it comes to the Johto starters, all 3 of them suck competitively, and that's a fact that cannot be disputed. So if all 3 of them suck competitively with no improvement made to them, and the ranking of the starters has been good, okay, and bad within them, then where is there room for the reception to grow? Typhlosion and Feraligatr still have the fun that they had from the Johto games, while Meganium has nothing. Yeah, none of them have anything competitively, but so does a Pokemon like Swampert, but people still like it for its in-game viability. Meganium has had neither, and though we still have the anime to talk about in terms of the Chikorita line, now will be a good time to speak about 2 other very hated starters, Tepig and Popplio. Popplio obviously evolves into Primarina, and Primarina is without a doubt the most feminine starter that we've gotten thus far. Now Popplio also suffered from a similar thing to Chikorita, where Rowlet and Litten were dominating in terms of in-game usage and popularity. People like these 2 starters way more, and it largely had to do with their base forms, not their final forms. By the time their middle evolutions came out, it was pretty much wraps for Popplio because people hated how goofy and dumb Brionne looked, but they appreciated the way Dartrix and Torracat were. So at this point, Popplio's fate was set in stone. Even for me, I liked Popplio, but the moment I saw Brionne, I was put off from the Pokemon. But then the final evolutions came out, and man, for me personally, I thought we had one of the most solid set of starters of all time. Primarina, though it was incredibly feminine, had a strong reception to it. Yes, there were still a bunch of people who don't like Primarina for its design, but guess what? There were also a ton of people who didn't like Incineroar's design as well. There were even a bunch of people who loved Rowlet so much that they were disappointed by Decidueye. The Primarina hate seemed over-exaggerated. Or like, it was more than the others because Primarina's pre-evolutions had carried the burden all the way through. So all Primarina really did for most people was offset the hate of its previous forms. If Primarina had magically been officially revealed first, then I guarantee that the same hate wouldn't have been there. In fact, I'm so sure about this because as people used Primarina in the game, they loved it, and furthermore, between all of the water stars in competitive play, Primarina is the most sought after and used Pokemon. People love using Primarina in both VGC and singles. It's an absolute monster. And now, aside from personal preference, you don't see people say anything bad about Primarina. They only ever talk about how strong of a Pokemon it is. Sure, some people may argue that its design is extremely elegant and beautiful, and others may argue that it's hideous and ugly. But that's a personal thing. You can make that argument for any single Pokemon. But in general, the receptivity of this Pokemon has changed once again, because it's a fun and strong Pokemon to use. Once again emphasizing that it has nothing to do with whether a Pokemon is masculine or feminine in nature. Emboar is Tepig's final form, and Emboar is incredibly masculine in nature, but Emboar is one of the most hated starter Pokemon of all time, alongside Meganium. Emboar's case is a little different. Emboar is hated because of its design, but more so for its typing, because it was like the 3rd fire and fighting typing that we had in a row. And while Tepig and Emboar were probably the best starters to use in the Unova games in terms of breezing through the story, it wasn't fun for people to use because they have just gone through the same dance for the past 2 generations. They wanted something different. And so, while it was a useful Pokemon, it wasn't a fun Pokemon to use. If that wasn't bad enough, it's probably the worst of the 3 fire and fighting type starters. Thus, Tepig and Emboar have the reception that they do now. Even if the design was better and appreciated, even if it was already useful in the games, the thing with Emboar is that it simply wasn't fun to use. And so, though I've been going on and on about being useful and powerful in the games, the true factor might just be that a starter has to be fun to use. A Pokemon should be fun to use one way or another, and Chikorita till date just hasn't been for most people. But you know what has been for most people who make it this far into one of my videos? The subscribe button. And I hope you do subscribe because 98% of my audience is unsubscribed. So I'd really appreciate if you could subscribe so I can continue to create videos like this one. But what's crazy to me is that though the Chikorita hate is pretty high up right now, if you look across the polls, Chikorita isn't even the most hated one. It's Tepig. Consistently, you'll find like over half the people want to pick Totodile, some people want to pick Chikorita, and a very, very small pool of people want to pick Tepig. So, like, why is no one complaining about Tepig being hated or not picked? especially since it literally is the least popular starter ever to come out of Kalos, and that's saying something. Maybe it's because Chikorita has like 3 extra generations of hate, or maybe it's because there are a lot more people who love Chikorita that want to defend it versus not so many people who like Tepig that care to defend it. Or maybe it's because people are out there looking for problems and trying to use Chikorita as a means to make that happen, but anywho, what do I know? Emboar is in the same, if not a worse position than Meganium, so I hope the long wait of using a fire and fighting type in the form of Emboar is good enough for people to finally appreciate the Pokemon, and I hope whatever buffs Meganium get in this game is enough to make people appreciate it as well. A Fairy type Mega, a region where it's somehow the strongest, overall buff to its move pool, a new ability, the possibilities are endless, and there's a lot of room to see this Pokemon in a new light. But you know where a lot of people didn't appreciate Chikorita? In the anime. Chikorita in the anime was super needy and clingy, and this further aggravated the hate that this Pokemon had because people really didn't like these traits, because the already air quote useless Pokemon game is acting up like this in the anime. Unfortunately, because this was Ash's first confirmed female Pokemon, I think people think it's a hate towards that aspect kind of thing, but no, it really isn't. It's just needy and clingy as a Pokemon with an already bad rep, and that too, what is Ash's weakest team ever. Look, just zoom out a bit. You'll see that the hate isn't for just Ash's Bayleaf here. People literally don't like any of Ash's Johto Pokemon. They're considered weaker versions of the Kanto team and less cool in every regard. Noctowl is only ever talked about because it's shiny, and that too, it's on the lower end of Ash's flying types, possibly even the lowest. Heracross is supposed to be the ace here, but I mean, it didn't get to do much, let alone have decent moves. I only remember being useful in the Sinnoh League. Totodile gets a pass for many people because of its personality, and since it's liked in the games too. It's probably on the best side of Ash's Johtomons, especially since Squirtle wasn't around here, whereas the other 2 Johto starters had Pokemon to be compared to. Cyndaquil, or I guess Quilava, I don't hear much about except that people like it because it's Cyndaquil, but Ash's Cyndaquil always gets like a meh response whenever it's talked about, so literally this is only being carried by the species and not Ash's actual Pokemon. Charizard was also around for a good portion of the anime here, and whenever Charizard was around, it pretty much became impossible for Cyndaquil to shine through. Bayleaf, in my eyes, is the strongest between this lot and Johto, but the problem is that that's not saying much considering all of Ash's Kanto starter Pokemon are probably stronger, and he's also been shown to use Pokemon like Snorlax by this point. But Bulbasaur by and large is far more competent and if I'm not mistaken was around with Ash throughout most of Johto, so Bayleaf probably cut some strays with that. But still, at the end of the day, while I thought Bayleaf's personality was cute, many others didn't. And I know what argument's about to come up. I just know that Brock is going to be used here to justify Bayleaf's neediness and clinginess, because Brock's gag was pretty much the same thing, just as a man towards a woman. But, see, that's where you don't get it. If Brock's gag was solely just that, it wouldn't work. Brock would also get the same hate that Bayleaf got, but Brock has proven time and time again to pull through for Ash and the gang. The gag is such a surface level part of his character, and he delivers where he needs to, through food, advice, just being helpful, or the big brother group saving the day. You name it, and Brock has done it. Bayleaf wasn't doing much of any of that on top of the existing rep. You gotta understand, it's 2 different scenarios altogether. I hate to bring any other anime into this, but if Jiraiya and Roshi were the way they were with women and weren't so strong and competent and didn't help Naruto and Goku be the people that they are today, they probably would have been hated and cancelled. That's what happened to Mineta after all, because he tried to run with the same joke without a certain level of competence, and he got all the hate, whereas these 2 geezers avoided simply because there was more to their character. It's the same thing here. Even if there were more to Bayleaf's character, which I think there was, just a bit anyways, it was overshadowed by Ash's previous Pokemon, which they probably learned the lesson because in Hoenn and onwards, Ash settled for new teams of Pokemon rather than using his old Pokemon team, probably because they struggled with this very thing. So no, even here, the problem was never that Bayleaf was a girl or that it was feminine. Literally, none of Ash's Johto Pokemon got a chance to shine. That's literally it. When you have feminine Pokemon like the ones I mentioned earlier, or even Pokemon that I didn't mention like Ribombee, Fluttermane, Frostlass, heck, my mascot Minccino can be seen as a feminine Pokemon. And let me tell you, Cinccino is strong as heck. But yeah, when you have Pokemon like these that are so well received and appreciated, I don't see how a statement can be made that people just hate Chikorita because it's feminine. It's obviously not true. Primarina would have been looped in the same way then, and Ember would have been widely loved. But neither of those things happened. The Chikorita hate comes from generations of not getting a chance to shine. But luckily, Chikorita alongside a few other starter Pokemon that didn't get a chance to shine will have their opportunity to do so now. So do people hate feminine Pokemon or feminine starter Pokemon? No. They just want to use Pokemon that have been proven to be fun, and at the moment, Meganium is no fun to use. I bet you that everyone is going to want to use it irrespective of how feminine it is with a fairy type regional form or a fairy type mega, and I myself cannot wait to use it. If you have any other topics that you think have been blown out of proportion in the Pokemon community, or anything else that you think is just this stupid that I can talk about, let me know in the comments down below. And hey, I might just make a video on it.